think data engineering, data analysis is becoming hugely important. I think we get more and more control over the data that comes from the soil, the data that comes from the farm itself. John Deere, we obviously sell John Deere, as I mentioned. So John Deere has a big drive in terms of development. They recently invested into a company that developed a spraying machine that has AI eyes. So the sprayer can identify the plant from a weed, and it can actually then only spray the plant. It can also read the healthiness of that particular plant, and it does it in milliseconds, and then decide on how much fertilizer needs to be applied. So they project that they can reduce the application of fertilizer or pesticides or chemicals by 90%, 90.
Massive.
So your potential disruption in that industry is obviously enormous. I think the data collection is the farmer wants more and more control over what he puts into the soil and how the soil will react to that.
He or she, hey?
He or she, absolutely.
Just checking.
A lot of she's.
Good.
And I think that's, in fact, Fairfax previously invested into a company called Farmers Edge in Canada, and they control the weather stations. So effectively the data that they collect on the farm from weather stations, from soil devices or whatever, you get a device now that's tested that you put into the soil, a meter under the soil, and it actually gives you a reading, a real-time reading on the soil, on the pH, water content. So it's quite interesting on where farming is going, and the more control you have, obviously the lesser cost. I think one thing that you need to realize is margins on farmers are getting pressurized, so you always have pressure on margins. So the farmers worldwide need to become more effective in growing, and AI, artificial intelligence, is going to help it. I mean, we're already having tractors for many, many years that can drive without an individual. So you don't necessarily need a tractor. You only need somebody that actually sits on the seat. So and it must be 80 kilograms heavy. So not everybody can do that, but the tractor drives itself. And the saving just by the tractor when it turns, putting the planter a millimeter from the previous row is enormous. In the old days, the farmer would go across the rows, or it would, skip a row. These days, it's actually very precise. So it's unbelievable to see.
So it's across that value chain, and I would imagine the use of AI as well in terms of distribution, transportation, remote sensing, the kinds of reduction of spoilage.
Credit assessment. You can use AI in credit assessment. So you can teach a system, your best credit manager and all his experience, you can download in that system, and you can teach that system on an ongoing basis how to spot a good credit, going forward. And that becomes a changed environment. So it's not just, a lot of people look at agriculture and say it's very old school, but agriculture has really changed a lot over the last 10 years in terms of technology.
One of our speakers at GIBS said a generation ago, and he was a black industrialist. He said a generation ago, if you'd said to your kid, get into farming, you would have said no ways. He said, now I'm telling all my kids to go farming. So including our Minister of Finance and his avot. Chris, you've got this vision around food security in Africa. And, we've spoken about you pulling out of the Nigerian operation. But the learnings around running the business and expanding out of the South African context across into different African markets, and having to adapt the strategy and how you play the game there. Why don't you share some of those experiences with us?
I think that, so first of all, what we need to realize, we generalize Africa almost as one country. We talk about Africa as if it's one country, and obviously it's different. I think sometimes people forget how small some of these countries are. You talk about, Namibia with, what is it, under 2 million people. So you really need to think the product that you take into it. So our mistake that we made initially is we almost wanted to create mini Afgris within these countries. Then you realize in a country like Zambia, where we actually had a successful business, and at some point government decided to go from kwacha to dollars, so just that switch from from local currency or international currency, that I'm talking about your transactional currency, had a huge negative impact. And only to decide a year later to switch back from, kwachas into dollars. So every time you take that, so the uncertainty of governments and reaction of governments sometimes has a negative impact on your business. So Zambia also like to set the pricing of raw material. So that in a sense, where you don't have free market, it really becomes difficult. So I think that is always a challenge. I think the one thing that you need to know, most of us deal in rands or in dollars or in euros. So having exposure to the local currency and potentially trying to extract dividends or loan repayments is difficult. And not all countries, not the laws of some of these countries are quite prohibitive in terms of extracting loan repayments. And there are certain ways in which you need to register those loans before. And so I think understanding the environment is critical. Making use of very good local partners is critical. And understanding the local way of doing, the local culture, I suppose, is critical.